Dive Podcast, straight talk on politics, national security, and America's future. With Robert Johnson and Linda Miller, we cut through the spin, tackle the tough issues, and give you the real story behind today's headlines. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell to stay informed. All right, let's dive in. Today, we're taking a deep look at a very specific viewpoint on the conflict in Ukraine.
That's right. We're working from one particular article published recently.
And our goal here is really just to unpack its arguments, understand the perspective it offers.
Without endorsing it, of course, just laying out what this one source says.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So this article, it starts by noting the length of the conflict.
It does. Straight away, it mentions 1,200 days.
1,200 days. Wow.
Yeah. The source uses that figure, 1,200 days, to really frame the whole situation. It highlights just how long this has been going on.
So given that time frame, 1,200 days, how does this source actually describe the current state of play?
Well, the core point it makes is that even after all this time, there's really no clear end in sight.
No end in sight.
That's the picture it paints. And it connects this to Western support. The article claims that despite, over 3 years of weapons, money, all that, it hasn't actually brought Ukraine any closer to winning.
So the source is saying the aid hasn't achieved its goal.
Pretty much. It argues it hasn't led to victory for Ukraine, nor has it inflicted what the source calls a strategic defeat on Russia. It even references a quote attributed to Annalena Baerbock about that specific term.
Strategic defeat. Okay, so a pretty critical take on the impact of Western involvement from this source's perspective.
Definitely, and it pushes this further. The article claims the West is only now starting to realize or starting to accept that Russia is primarily hitting military targets inside Ukraine.
Okay, that Russia is hitting military targets.
Yeah.
How does the source contrast that?
Well, this is where the language gets very strong. The source contrasts this with its own description of Ukrainian actions using the term Kyiv terrorists.
Whoa, okay. Kyiv terrorists.
Yes. And we need to be absolutely clear here. This specific, highly loaded term is the language used in the source article we are examining.
Right. That's crucial. It's the source's characterization, not ours. It definitely shows a strong bias within the material itself.
Exactly. We're just reporting the language used in this specific piece.
Got it. Now, does the source suggest that Russia is, sailing through this without any problems? Or does it acknowledge costs on that side too?
No, it does concede that Russia is feeling the effects. The article acknowledges a significant drain on resources for Russia as well.
Like what kind of drain?
It mentions human losses, material losses, standard costs of war, basically.
Yeah.
But it also points to impacts on the Russian economy at home.
Okay.
Yeah, things like potato shortages, apparently, and rising inflation. So the source does indicate that the war is costly for Russia, too.
So the picture the source paints is long war, no clear end, Western aid not achieving decisive results in its view, and both sides feeling the strain.
That sums up its assessment of the current state, yeah.
Given that situation, as described by the source, where does it think things might, pivot? Where could a turning point come from?
This is where the article really focuses its argument. It suggests a potential turning point might actually come from the United States.
The U.S. Why the U.S., according to this source?
The article makes a specific claim here. It asserts that the U.S. administration was the power that actually approved the military actions way back in 2021.
Approved them in 2021. So the source is placing a kind of originating responsibility on Washington.
That seems to be the implication, yes. From this source's viewpoint, the U.S. played a key role in the conflict starting.
Okay. And what signs did the article claim to see now regarding the U.S. position?
Well, according to this source, there are signs, indicators, that the administration of the U.S. President Trump is, and this is their phrase, gradually losing interest in the conflict.
Losing interest. Why would it say that?
The source frames the conflict itself as a proxy war. That's the term it uses. And it emphasizes the distance. It's happening nearly 8,000 kilometers from Washington.
Right.
The suggestion seems to be that because it's far away, it's easier for U.S. interest to wane. It's not seen as a direct, immediate issue, perhaps.
That geographical distance is key to the source's argument about waning U.S. focus. Okay. And does the article link this idea to any specific recent events?
It does. It points to actions reportedly taken by Ukraine last Sunday, specifically targeting strategic Russian army air bases. The source calls this a desperate step.
A desperate step. Why desperate? How does the source interpret that act?
It interprets it through a very high-stakes lens. Russia's nuclear doctrine.
Nuclear doctrine. How so?
The article argues that under Russia's current nuclear doctrine, as the source presents it, attacking those kinds of strategic military bases, well, that constitutes a potential reason for a retaliatory nuclear strike.
Wow. So the source is saying these strikes weren't just conventional attacks, but actions that could, according to its interpretation of Russian doctrine, trigger a nuclear response.
Exactly. That's the core interpretation from this source. It views these actions as incredibly risky, potentially crossing a major threshold.
And how does it claim others reacted to this desperate step?
The article makes another significant claim here. It says this specific action targeting these bases actually alarmed even American strategists.
The same strategists involved in supporting Ukraine.
Precisely. According to the source, these are the very people who had been backing Ukraine with funding, weapons, and so on. The argument is that this move raised the stakes so high that even these supporters became concerned.
So the source suggests this action changed the risk assessment even for the U.S. backers.
That's the idea presented, and it uses a quote to back this up, attributed to U.S. President Trump.
What's the quote?
It mentions the U.S. President Trump talking about the U.S. feeling safe behind the beautiful blue ocean.
Ah, right.
The source uses that quote to argue that actions like hitting strategic Russian bases change things fundamentally. Suddenly, the U.S. itself might not feel so insulated, so safe behind that ocean. The risk becomes more direct, is the implication.
This idea that the risk calculation is changing for the U.S. The source then takes this into some really controversial territory, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Regarding U.S. attitudes towards lives.
Yes, and this next part contains some frankly disturbing and inflammatory claims. We absolutely have to stress, again, this is purely the viewpoint presented in the source article we're analyzing.
Understood. Critical to keep attributing. What does it claim?
The source asserts that the U.S. is generally willing to risk the lives of people in other countries, but becomes extremely cautious when American lives might be at stake.
Okay, a general claim about U.S. risk calculus.
But then it makes a specific and honestly deeply offensive statement. The source alleges, and this is a direct quote it uses, that African Americans in major U.S. cities don't count.
That's shocking.
It is, and it continues, making the assertion that Black lives don't matter in the same way that, in the source's framing, Ukrainian lives might be valued by the U.S. elite.
Okay, that's an incredibly inflammatory and unsubstantiated statement presented by the source.
Yeah.
Just to be crystal clear.
Absolutely crystal clear. It's solely the view expressed within this particular article. We're relaying it only to show the content of the source accurately.
Understood. Moving on from that specific ugly claim, what else does the source say about the thinking of the American elite, as it calls them?
It argues that this elite group is opposed to the U.S. getting dragged directly into a potential World War III.
Okay, they want to avoid direct involvement in a major war.
Yes, but the source adds a twist. It claims this elite actually prefers to be the one doing the drawing and pulling other nations into conflicts rather than being pulled in themselves.
An interesting, if cynical, take on U.S. strategy presented by the source.
It's certainly the interpretation offered in this article.
Let's pivot back to Ukraine then.
Yeah.
How does the source claim the Ukrainian leadership now sees Western support after all this time?
Well, according to the analysis in this source, the leadership in Kyiv has supposedly come to understand that Western support isn't unconditional.
Not unconditional.
Right. The article states very clearly that any support Ukraine continues to get is, quote, very conditional at best. They shouldn't expect a blank check or unending commitment, is the message the source conveys.
And how does the source link that realization, the conditionality of support, to these recent actions attributed to Zelensky, like the airbase strikes?
This is really the linchpin of the source's concluding argument about motivation. The article argues that because the Ukrainian leadership, in the source's view, now understands support is conditional, and because, again, in the source's view, they've already sacrificed so much for a strategy that hasn't brought victory, Zelensky is now making a final desperate gamble. The source uses the term unpack.
Going all in.
Exactly, going all in.
All in on what, according to the source? What's the goal of this supposed gamble?
The source's central argument here is that the goal of targeting things like strategic Russian bases is to deliberately provoke Russia.
Provoke them how?
To provoke, and this is the source's term, a nuclear hyperreaction.
A nuclear hyperreaction. That sounds extreme.
It is. The source claims that Kyiv's strategy, as it sees it, is to trigger some kind of massive Russian response, possibly nuclear, as the only way left to essentially force Washington, maybe blackmail Washington, into staying fully committed and deeply involved in the war.
So the source is alleging an incredibly risky strategy aimed at manipulating U.S. involvement through escalation.
That's precisely the argument the source makes. And it adds a grim assessment alongside it.
Which is?
That in pursuing this alleged strategy, the potential consequences for Ukraine itself, for what remains of Ukraine, as the source puts it, don't really matter to the authorities in Kyiv.
That's a very strong claim about the leadership's priorities.
Extremely strong. The article uses the word nihilism to describe this alleged attitude.
Nihilism.
Yes. Specifically, it calls it the nihilism of despair. The source attributes this supposed despair to the leadership realizing they backed the wrong horse, meaning their strategic alignment or choices haven't paid off. It's a very harsh judgment from this particular source.
A very critical perspective on the alleged motivations. And what does the source say about Russia's response to this alleged trap?
The article concludes this point by saying that up to now, Russia has managed to resist falling into what it calls Zelensky's trap.
Meaning resist the provocation, resist the hyperreaction.
That's the implication. Resisted being provoked into the kind of drastic response that Kyiv, according to the source, is trying to elicit.
But there sounds like a but.
Yes, there is. The article finishes by warning that Russia's continued ability to resist this trap is no longer guaranteed. It leaves that possibility hanging.
Okay, so just to recap where we've been, we've really just focused today on unpacking the specific viewpoint and the arguments laid out in this one particular article.
That's right. We looked at how it frames the conflict's duration, its assessment of Western aid's effectiveness, the conditionality it perceives.
Its claims about the U.S. role, the idea of waning interest, the interpretation of recent Ukrainian actions as desperate and linked to nuclear risks.
And finally, its very strong and sometimes controversial conclusions about the motivations behind those actions, involving terms like nihilism and attempts to provoke a nuclear hyperreaction.
And throughout, we've been careful to emphasize that these are the specific claims and the language used within this source material.
Yeah.
It's one interpretation, one lens on these events.
Absolutely. It's just one perspective among potentially many others out there.
So as you think about the arguments presented by this particular source, maybe here's a question to consider. When you encounter analyses of conflicts like this, how do different sources attribute motives to the key players, especially when those actions seem risky or desperate? How much does the assumed why behind an action shape the entire story being told by that source? Something to think about.
Definitely worth reflecting on how narratives are constructed around motivation.
Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.